so now I'm going to get to how to a very secret and very important ritual that it's not really spoken about a whole lot, but there are pieces of it everywhere. And that's how it is with huge spiritual events that happen. Usually these spiritual events will happen at the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new one. There will be some big initiation that happens with humanity, but also in higher realms. And this is really, this is symbolized in what I would call the ritual of the sleeping kings. And it represents that clear pathway between 3D and 5D and the merging of the higher self with the lower self and that pure incarnation, okay? So here we go, the ritual of the sleeping kings. And in your booklet, there should be some images. Let's see what page we're on now. Starting on page 25, you can see an image of a king, and he's sitting there. And it says, the sleeping king mythos represents the conscious sleep of the great priest kings in the higher planes. So what is this idea of the sleeping king and the great priest kings that are sleeping in the higher planes? What does that represent? What is that ritual that occurred? What does it mean for humanity? And who are these sleeping kings? What is this? It actually is in a lot of different fairy tales and a lot of different things. In order to understand the sleeping kings, we have to understand the connection between Venus and the earth and that clear line that's created between them, because that's exactly what the sleeping kings represent. Okay, so there was a ritual that was done, and it's actually been done a few different times, and it's a very symbolic ritual, but it has taken place in various different densities and dimensions as a density shifts. So anytime you move down in density, this ritual will occur. And this ritual is all about capturing the logos of the era. Now, the logos of the era is captured in the masculine energy or the masculine force. That's why they're kings and they're not queens. There's different specific initiations with women and queens than there are kings, but because of the era that we're in, we're going to go with kings because it's the most important information for this time. So basically what happens when we move down in density at certain points, whenever there's a shift, what will happen is very high beings, what you would call masters, will basically place themselves in something that's called stasis. Sometimes it's called enchanted sleep or cosmic sleep. And why they place themselves in this stasis is so that as they're consciously dreaming, they're projecting their consciousness into the densities below them. So their consciousness is kind of becoming part of our collective consciousness. And this happens at the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new one at a certain astrological event when the moon and the sun and the earth stand together. And so these great beings will actually rest in stasis, and they'll hold a space so that clear energies can be projected from the higher planes to the lower planes. So by them resting in stasis, by them resting in this enchanted sleep, they're able to, with their consciousness, step down energy for us. So it's a great sacrifice. It's one of the first sacrifices, actually, before death was before we really died. This is what occurred. So there is a phase where it was 7 kings, but there's also a phase where it is 12 kings. But the overall pattern is the embodying of certain elements of human consciousness, certain elements of the logos into a human form, and then projecting it down onto the earth. And this is also why they call the sun the solar logos, or the mind. And it's also associated with the masculine. Well, there's very real rituals that occurred that allowed a certain quality of the collective consciousness to exist and a certain structure on the earth to form because of these higher density beings that essentially place themselves in an enchanted sleep or a stasis. They offered themselves. They offered their wisdom here. They project it down. These are masters. Okay, and so they have to do that, and they have to offer themselves as things go down in density, because as the earth moves down into a heavier density, we forget. There needs to be a force that is projecting themselves downward so that we don't forget too much. There has to be something for the remembering. And this is why sometimes you'll get images of these kings sleeping in this chamber in the earth. Well, they're taking on the planetary logos. They're taking on that force within their own minds. These are very great beings. These are very great masters. And they're actually physically, humanly embodying the rays of the sun, the rays of the cosmos, and through their own mind projecting them and offering them to mankind. And so that ritual is the ritual of the sleeping kings, the 7 or the 12, depending on the density in which the ritual was done. So they're also called priest kings. And at the end of the phase, they placed themselves or were placed ritualistically into a state of stasis or a state of conscious sleep. Now, this is a very advanced technology. I'm not talking about Walt Disney's frozen chamber where he wanted to make himself live forever. But certainly the people that try to make themselves live forever are certainly very aware of the sleeping kings. They're very aware probably of this ritual, and they're trying to mimic it, okay? But it's also called, meditative sleep. And it's a type of spiritual technology. It's an entire tomb, and it involves certain spiritual technologies that are done. It's in a different density than the third density, but we're still affected by it. And when you move into the higher spheres, the higher planes, you can almost look at certain rays of light or even planetary bodies as a man or as a person. And this is exactly what the Greeks did and the Romans did when they named planets people and all this. There are very big consciousnesses that personify, and they go into sort of this conscious meditative sleep. It's a very, very heightened spiritual state that we don't really understand. And they project their consciousness downward for us to live within and for us to reference, because as we fall, we need that service. We need that sacrifice. Okay? I hope this is making sense. I know that this one is really, really wild. I know it's really, really strange. And sometimes it's difficult to grasp how something would occur in a higher dimension and affect us in a lower dimension. But this is exactly how it's done. It's done through a living, breathing human that is in a different density. And as you move down, things get sort of smaller and more compressed, but they're still referencing waves of consciousness from a higher plane. Okay, this also allows their mind to be shared for humanity. It becomes part of the collective consciousness, and it creates a structure. Also, this allows their energy to project downward and shine during a dark age. And a lot of the sleeping hero mythos or the sleeping king mythos, there's always this element of the sleeping king is going to wake up one day and he's going to return. This represents one of the priest kings that reincarnates again. So you have a sleeping king that is an exalted essence, that's past the Venusian initiation, that's is an exalted force that reincarnates. That means that he wakes up and he now enters the reincarnation cycle. Because even if you're sleeping, you still have a reincarnation cycle that you have to adhere to. But there's still an aspect of you that's in stasis, or an aspect of you that's in conscious sleep in a higher plane. But you're still going through your incarnations in a lower plane. So you could also look at it this way. This is when this was first done, it was an action done by great initiates. You could view it, it was done first, but it is a spiritual technology that we will all do, or that we will all remember being done. Okay? So we will eventually align with this memory, and us doing it at a certain point as well. That's part of being human, is remembering these rituals that happen on higher planes that allowed us to project ourselves onto these lower planes. Hope this is making sense. So, because this is an ascended consciousness consciously sleeping, the consciously sleeping represents an awakened higher self, and you can directly project you can directly kind of connect and communicate with your higher self when you're in a conscious sleep. So it means you're lucid. So there's a stronger connection there. So yeah, it also represents an evolutionary step. It's very parallel to how when Christ came to the earth and he offered himself to the world on the cross, and he offered, through his blood, he offered the earth the codes of initiation. It's the same concept. Through their conscious sleep, they're offering the earth a certain level of consciousness. It's a certain sacrifice. It's a descension kind of sacrifice, whereas Christ was almost like an ascension sacrifice. This makes sense. All right. So if you look up the king in the mountain mythos, or the king under the mountains, or the sleeping hero mythos, you'll find all of these different stories that are basically all about this one very, very ancient, higher dimensional ritual that was done that actually allows our earth to take form, that actually makes it so our earth doesn't get lost as it moves through time, and it will be maybe perhaps much more clear to you. All right, so it really helps move down in density. That's really what it's about. The sleep, the stasis and the conscious sleep by these higher beings, it allows a certain consciousness level to be retained and not lost. Okay, this is what they're offering. This is what they're contributing. And you need to have somebody volunteer or be at a certain level to do that, to offer themselves to the world. But to us, it's just the level of our consciousness. To us, it's just the level of our mind. But to them, it's a real, physical, solid incarnation. To us in this play, in this 3D world, the higher densities to us are like wisps. But when you get into those higher densities, it's just as real there as it is here, because that's the point in consciousness. So these rituals do occur. And there are very intense spiritual cosmic rituals that are done in higher planes by higher beings that allow us to connect. And this is one of those rituals. This is the sleeping priest kings. And this is what allows us to stay connected and retain a certain level of connectivity. So it seems like, how does this happen? But in those higher dimensions, it's just as real to them, right, as it is here for us. So in the Christian tradition, there's, in your little booklet, you'll notice that there is an image of something called the 7 sleepers. And you can see that there's 7 men, and they're going in the earth, and they're falling asleep. And this is to remind us of that sacrifice of the priest kings that are asleep in the higher worlds, projecting themselves downward for us, okay? And sometimes I remember seeing like weird videos of people saying that they found these kings in stasis and they were like physical people. This is not the same thing. This is like a weird thing. This is a higher dimensional thing that may be copied or have aspects in the lower planes, but the location of these beings, the real priest kings, is in a different density at this time. Okay, so there's a depiction of the 7 sleepers in a cave outside the city of Ephesus, which is the traditional Christian depiction of this initiation. And mystery schools and temple cultures will also have rituals where they repeat this, where they will have people in a tomb. And they will have the 12 knights of the round table. They'll have the 12 disciples of Christ. And they'll have rituals where there's a sleeping and a rising and things like that, because it represents the transmission of consciousness from dimensions, which is the linking and the bridging of consciousness. All these priest kings are in the higher densities is a bridge. They're allowing themselves to be a bridge. Literally, their consciousness is a bridge. We are using their consciousness, their world, to live our life. And that's why when you see the masters, why they're such great initiators, is because they're at a level where they're personifying something so great that it encompasses them and they can actually emit it. Okay? All right, and so there's also, what I found really interesting about this is there's also like a second interpretation of King Arthur, where he's actually depicted as going to sleep or going into this enchanted sleep state. There is a really interesting alternative ending to Arthur that I found that ends where he didn't actually die. He actually entered a state of conscious sleep. And he did this because the whole point of that is when you go into this state of conscious sleep, it's so that you can offer yourself while you're sleeping through your consciousness to others. And this would happen again when we move down in density. These gods or these higher beings would go into this state of conscious sleep, of stasis, and they would maintain the energy of that density in the humanized form and offer themselves. And in a way, we incarnate into their mind. And it sounds like you just took 10 hits of LSD or something when you hear that, but this is actually a very real thing, and these are very real rituals and very real spiritual human technologies, ritual, especially like this, that are done with the cosmos on very specific times. That's a technology. Human ritual is a technology, and the sleeping kings are a technology, and they are offering themselves to mankind, and these are personified often as aspects in what are called the Ascended Masters, the Great White Brotherhood. These are the aspects of these sleeping kings. This is how we personify them, and we know them, and they appear here in this world. And so there's a really interesting quote about the legend of Arthur, and it sort of says something that I found really interesting as it comments on how they positioned themselves when they were sleeping. So in this legend, again, Arthur doesn't die. He goes into this state of enchanted sleep with all of his knights at the round table. And in this alternative legend, this is what it says. They are in the caverns under the roots of the hazel tree on the craggy Dinas, where King Arthur and all of his knights are laying asleep in a circle, their heads outward. The sleeping priest kings. And then we also have, traditionally you'll find in your handout, You'll also see a depiction of a sleeping King Barbarossa. And the sleeping King Barbarossa myth is the same mythos. He is asleep in the mountain. In this picture, he's got the sword, he's got the grail behind him. So he's got the phallic image of the sword. He's got the feminine image of the chalice beside him. He's got his crown on and he's sleeping in the earth. He's sleeping in the inner earth. And that imagery with the red robe, the beard, the sword, and the chalice, this is very hinting a lot at this kind of spiritual ritual technology that a lot of mystery schools and temple cultures still have, and they leave these hints of these great rituals that have taken place in the higher realms that serve us, these great sacrifices and offerings to us from higher beings. They keep these alive in our minds directly through rituals and through art. And some of these images, certainly the Tale of Arthur, a lot of these images that contain this are showing to us the type of human spiritual technology that we are coming back into, but that was very alive at that time, that is very alive in Venusian culture, and that is very alive, you could say, in the inner earth. There's another really good image of Barbarossa with his great long beard. They're often depicted as red-headed, and that's because the red hair also signifies a certain phase of Venusians becoming and incarnating as human in that very specific level. Okay. Oh yes, now perhaps my favorite version of the Sleeping King was a little bit sneaky. And you may not notice it or you may not remember it, but it is from the Alice in Wonderland series. And if you guys have followed my channel, and certainly Dark Journalists, who is here tonight, Dark Journalist did an amazing, amazing show on Alice in Wonderland, and he's quite versed in the Alice mythos. But the Sleeping King appears as the Red King, and it's so interesting that the Barbarossa is often depicted as wearing red, and the Red King in Alice is also wearing red. That's very interesting. So in Alice in Wonderland, she comes across, it's Alice Through the Looking Glass. She actually comes across the Red King, who is asleep. So here is actually Wikipedia's summary of Alice meeting the sleeping Red King. Alice first meets him. He is fast asleep, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum says. And Alice, even prior to seeing him, mistakes the sound he is making for lions or tigers. During this time, Tweedledum and Tweedledee state that she is part of the Red King's dream, and she will go out, bang, like a candle when he wakes. Tweedledum and Tweedledee state that she is part of the Red King's dream, and she will go out, bang, like a candle when he wakes. What is this saying? This is revealing to us a sort of cosmic truth of worlds within worlds of within worlds, of Earth being within Venus, which is within the Pleiades, which is within Sirius, and on and on and on. And all of those structures are a mind, a logos, a construct associated with a certain density in which we have within us and can access when we can reach it, when we can integrate it. And every one of those constructs has a personified force. And that ritual is held by conscious sleep of these higher beings. A state of conscious sleep. Very, very important aspect of human spiritual evolution up and down the densities, especially down the densities, is this idea of conscious sleep and aspects of ourself that are in stasis somewhere projecting downwards. And the very first times it was done by these great beings who sacrificed their own consciousness for us to incarnate within. And I always thought it was really interesting when you look at the sort of higher civilizations spiritually that were on Earth and the really interesting tombs they would create, like especially in Egypt, where they used all this gold. And I actually think it was Dark Journalist actually that brought this up, but it's almost as though the Egyptian mummies and the practice of Egyptian mummification is trying to simulate or emulate this conscious sleep. This idea that we are sort of living forever, that we've transcended death, or that we can just go into this sort of very slow stasis and project ourselves in different places, and this kind of control over the material plane like these higher beings, these masters have. So that's what the mummification reminds me of, and also some of the other tomb building stuff that they do, where it's sort of about preserving and all these metals or technologies, and that's actually what they used in the actual stasis rituals, is they use certain materials to hold their form like that and stuff. So it's very much like it's almost happening on Earth with the various mummification practices.